Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Jill Filipovic's new book, Okay Boomer, Let's Talk, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until, after over 93 years, the Strand is a sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors like Jill and Anand, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so appreciative of it. Tonight, we are beyond excited to have with us Jill Filipovic to celebrate the release of her new book, Okay Boomer, Let's Talk, How My Generation Got Left Behind. Jill is a Brooklyn-based journalist, lawyer, and author of The H-Spot, The Feminist Pursuit of Happiness, a weekly columnist for CNN and a 2019 New America Future of War Fellow. She's also a contributing opinion writer to the New York Times and a former columnist for The Guardian. Her work has appeared in Time Magazine, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and the anthologies Nasty Women, Feminism, Resistance, and Revolution in Trump's America, and Yes Means Yes, Visions of Female Sexual Power and a World Without Rape. Joining Jill in conversation is Anand Giridharadas. Anand is the author of, most recently, Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world, published by Knopf in 2018. His other books are The True American, Murder and Mercy in Texas, about a Muslim immigrant's campaign to spare from death row the white supremacists who tried to kill him, and India Colleague, an intimate portrait of a nation's remaking, about returning to the India his parents left. He is an editor-at-large for Time and an on-air political analyst for MSNBC, and a visiting scholar at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at New York University. He is a former columnist and correspondent for the New York Times, having written, most recently, the biweekly Letter from America. His datelines have included Italy, India, China, Dubai, Norway, Japan, Haiti, Brazil, Colombia, Nigeria, Uruguay, and the United States. He has also written for the Times arts, business, and travel pages, and its book review, Sunday review, and magazine, and for The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and elsewhere. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jill and Anand to the stage.
Jill,
Hi.
how are you?
I'm good. Anand, I can't see you. Can you see me?
So sad. We're gonna fix that momentarily. I'm hoping. While I am
There you are.
there, I am. So congratulations on publishing this great book. I just want to inform people because I feel people should have all the information. Before we start this conversation, that maybe the first time you and I met, or one of the first times we met, and you tell me if this is wrong, we spent an entire day, along with a few other people, an entire day, morning to night, on Roosevelt Island, in between Manhattan and Queens. The day culminated in our attempt to catch an iPhone thief using the Find My iPhone function, which we succeeded in doing, but he turned out not to be a thief. And the night ended in a guy named Sal's apartment, staring at a plant that only blooms one night a year. Is all of that accurate?
That is 100% accurate. And it was my cell phone that the thief, who was not a thief, carried around with him all day.
Yes. So I just wanted to get that out of the way apropos of absolutely nothing. So I want to begin by reading this sentence here at the beginning that's very helpful in explaining what this book is. You say, "Okay, boomer," which is this phrase, insult, whatever you want to call it, that you hear all around. "Okay, boomer" is more than just an imperious insult. It's frustrated millennial shorthand for the ways the same people who created many of our problems now pin the blame on us. Explain.
So, as much as boomers are apparently profoundly insulted by people saying, "Okay, boomer," well before that was sort of a Twitter online catchphrase, there is this whole sort of what I call the boomer outrage industrial complex in the book. So a whole set of concerted efforts to essentially froth up generational anger, primarily at millennials, which if you watch something like Fox News, you know that millennial means anybody under the age of 40. So it's like the 17-year-old high school student. And then somebody like me who's 37 and lives in Brooklyn.
Basically all people who do not watch Fox News.
All people who do not watch Fox News, who fall under some very generous umbrella of young. So there has been, for sort of as long as I've been an adult, which is too long, this whole outrage complex of pinning blame on a changing society on young people, and that is certainly not new, right? Like older generations have always looked at the young and accused them of doing it wrong. But what's different now is you have right-wing media outlets on television and online really pinning today's ills on millennials and pinning our own problems on us. So saying that millennials are, you know, these avocado toast eating, hyper PC, super indulged, whiny babies, you know, who can't buy a house because they're spending all their money, you know, on Sunday brunch. Instead of really looking at, well, what changed between the time that baby boomers were coming of age and were hitting adulthood that enabled them to, you know, buy homes, raise families, live in relative middle class comfort, and what has shifted for millennials that we can't do that? And is it really a choice that millennials are deeply in debt, not buying homes at the same rate as baby boomers, you know, getting married later, having fewer kids than we even say that we want? And so the message is that this is our fault. This is the fault of the young. And it really is a kind of convenient mechanism to avoid having to look at, well, what were the political decisions that were made, you know, certainly before I had the right to vote, that shaped what my opportunities and what the landscape was facing the rest of my generation.
So you have this fabulous list of all the things millennials are blamed for: the death of American cheese, the death of, you know, business, the death of family.
The death of sex and parks, which is my favorite one.
So I want to actually just selfishly have you get you to use this book to defend me in this ongoing argument that I get into all the time, and I never come out well in, which is I will on Twitter critique what I consider boomer overrepresentation in some sphere of American life. And I feel like I am on like incredibly solid ground. I mean, you talk about presidential politics or Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, the entire leadership, right? I feel like I'm on pretty solid ground saying maybe new blood. Or I talk about the New York Times op-ed roster. Now you're an exception on it, but like there's just a lot of people who have had that column for between 30 and 350 years. And I think it'd be better just have some new blood. And every time I get into this, I get a more anger than I usually get from almost anything else I say, which is a lot of stuff, that this is ageism, that I am like an age Nazi, that I am doing for age what Donald Trump is doing for race. Can you help me out of this situation? Because I really don't feel the critics are right, but I need your help.
Well, I guess what I would say is that the goal is not to tell boomers that they need to be like put out to pasture and go die somewhere, right? The request is not to remove boomers from society. The request is to share power, influence, and access, and to have that be proportionate. What we're seeing, boomers have dominated politics, culture, ever since they came of age. So boomers are now no longer the largest generation in America. That's millennials. And yet 80% of the Senate is still over the age of 55. 0% of the Senate is under the age of 40. And that wasn't true when boomers were young. There are many boomer senators, for example, people like Rick Santorum, people like Russ Feingold.
Joe Biden.
Joe Biden is too old to be a boomer, believe it or not.
But he was very young when he got to the Senate.
Yeah, Joe Biden was 30 when he took his Senate seat, right? So it's not like there's no precedent for this. And yet we still, even though the oldest millennials are turning 40 this year, we still haven't seen a single millennial in the Senate. We saw a record number of millennials elected to Congress in the 2018 midterms, and millennials went from 1% of Congress to 6%. We're 22% of the population in the United States, and we're all legal adults. So we are underrepresented, that would make sense to an extent, right? Of course, people, the youngest of whom are 24, are going to be underrepresented in Congress, but we're underrepresented to a degree that boomers were not when they were our age and when they were the largest adult generation. And I think it's great. Boomers are living longer, working longer. There are a lot of boomers with a lot of wisdom and experience to share and to impart. But when you don't have boomers sharing the stage and sharing the mic, what you get are staid politics that are not representative of what younger generations of Americans need looking forward to the future. And you get business and op-ed pages and magazine mastheads and nonprofits and advocacy movements that are run by people who they're not necessarily serving or talking to. And that, as you say, it's not just a matter of like, let's get new blood. It's also a matter of, well, is this actually representative? We talk about this in terms of gender and race as well, all of which I think are important sort of things to look at. But often when we do talk about age, you hear, well, it's about experience and wisdom. And sure, that's true, and we should take that into account. But millennials aren't children. We're not high schoolers. We're at this point adults who have been pretty systematically shut out of influence, power, and access in a way that boomers just weren't.
One of the points people make sort of in objection to the point you just made is, are you saying that if a Bernie Sanders steps aside and a Pete Buttigieg steps up, that's generational change, but in some ways it may be a more conservative direction, that we shouldn't ascribe, progressivism to age?
No, and we shouldn't. Obviously, there are going to be examples of Bernie Sanders versus, not even Pete Buttigieg, Josh Hawley, who I think is technically a Gen Xer, but he's close, he's on the cusp. But that said, millennials are overwhelmingly more progressive than boomers. That's not to say that boomers are all conservative. Boomers are divided pretty evenly down the middle between left and right. And I think millennials and younger people, Gen Zers, have been pretty clear that they would much rather vote for a Bernie Sanders, somebody who shares their politics, than a Pete Buttigieg, somebody who perhaps shares their age cohort. I guess I would say, though, that generally those two things line up more clearly than in the Pete Buttigieg, Bernie Sanders example. You look at the millennials in Congress, people like AOC, people like Lauren Underwood out of Illinois, and I do think you see that not, universally, but for the most part, millennial representatives are representing millennial ideals, which are much more left than boomer ideals.
I want to ask you about, when doing this kind of work, the concept of a generation is itself tricky, the way the concept of a gender or a race or any kind of grouping of very large heterogeneous groups of people is. How much of the idea of these two generations that you write about are just fictions, like the things people say about they're just not real and they're actually true of everybody? And how much are, and when you get rid of those fictions, what is left as real distinguishing psychological traits of these two generations that are different?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing that is kind of made up is that we're the first generation that has invented this intergenerational conflict, right? Or that millennials are the first generation of people whom older folks have looked at and said, you guys are idiots and you're changing the world for the worse. Or that boomers are the first generation of older folks who young people have criticized for, ruining our lives and not changing quickly.
Ballet of human existence.
Right, this is like as it ever was. When boomers were young too, they were also, written off as the me generation by Tom Wolfe, and pretty roundly lampooned as, narcissists who didn't really know what they were doing. So that stuff is definitely not brand new. I think what is new is the degree to which millennials, as the most racially diverse adult generation in American history, as a generation that came of age in an era of incredible concentration of wealth into a small number of hands, and to a small number of, frankly, older hands and white hands. We are the first generation that is not going to do better than our parents, that probably will not do better than our grandparents. And that's true not just for the white millennials who, have had long legacies of families who have tended to do pretty well, but it's also true of millennials of color, for whom we have a narrative about generational rise, right? But the reality is a Black millennial today is less likely to own their home than a Black young adult was during the civil rights movement.
Wow.
So we've seen a decline that is really contrary to some of our kind of most deeply held national stories about progress and, you know, who's kind of doing better than people who look like them or share their characteristics used to do. So that's the part that really is new, you know, that millennials have faced a set of challenges that young people in America have not before faced.
You know, some years ago when I was working on a project about inequality, I had this kind of epiphany that one way to think about inequality is how different societies, or the same society at different moments in time, how people apportion their love for their own children versus everybody else's children, right? And of course you love your own children more, but in different societies, actually, there's a certain amount of love for other people's children, at greater or lesser level, for the commons. And you have the sentence that made me think of that. Much of what individual boomers did for the benefit of their own kids, their generation didn't do for society at large. Instead, they hoarded resources for themselves. So it seems like maybe one thing to say about boomers is there was actually more love and attention and focus than in previous generations on their kids and less on everybody else's kids.
I think that's absolutely right. And, you know, I think on an individual level among boomers, that was not necessarily intentional, right? Especially among the more progressive boomers who are half of their generation, who were not voting for the kinds of policies that, you know, somebody like Ronald Reagan put into place. So, you know, hashtag not all boomers. But one thing that I think is pretty unique about boomers is that they were the sort of original helicopter parents and the original friend parents. You know, millennials grew up having personal relationships with, you know, coaches and teachers and parents who cared about your feelings and, you know, sort of, I think, often determined to do a better job at connecting on a personal level with their kids than perhaps their parents were with them. And now we're sort of tarred as snowflakes for being emotionally mature adults who think other people's feelings matter. But that is very much, I think, a carryover of sort of boomer parenting norms. But at the same time that that was happening, as boomers were investing tremendous emotional resources to their children, whatever financial resources they had into their children, you did see this big pullback of public investment in resources, in things like higher education, in things like the social safety net, even in things like, you know, basic infrastructure and planning for the future. And that's a very different world than the one that baby boomers grew up in, where you did see these tremendous investments, you know, in housing, in roads, in higher education that enabled boomers to go to college in record numbers. And so I often hear from boomers when they hear the title of my book that one of the sort of points of being offended is, well, but I've done so much for my kid. Like, how can you say boomers don't care? I helped pay for my kid's college tuition. I still pay my child's cell phone bill. You know, I've let my kid live at home. I've been this great support system. And for a lot of boomer parents, that's absolutely true. But the result of that is that for millennials, whatever resources and opportunities your parents had very fundamentally shaped whatever opportunities and resources you had. And in a country with increasing inequality and with an increasing concentration of resources into relatively few hands, I think there are a lot of us that are looking around and realizing, well, you know, even if you are somebody like me who frankly benefited quite a bit from this system, who had parents who had resources, and therefore as an adult have resources myself, you know, I can look around and realize, like, sure, I worked hard, but that's not what got me to a middle-class life, right? And that's fundamentally counter to the message that I got growing up and the promise that was made to people in my generation.
I want to ask you about something that I know is, you know, top of mind for all Americans, which is the internal dynamics of the New York Times op-ed page. So there was this, you know, famous situation earlier this pandemic, Tom Cotton's op-ed, and this, you know, really civil war that broke out within the New York Times. That fell very much along generational lines, but then there was some discussion about, is it really generational lines? And one of the most eloquent Black responses to the thing was actually an older Black journalists, but there was this question, it was generational civil war, it was a racial civil war, obviously. It was the wokes versus the old guard at the paper. I wonder how you saw that episode through the lens of your writing.
Yeah, so a lot of the narrative about that was, these are the youngs coming in and trying to change things. I think that is a little too simplistic to what was actually happening there. For the record, I contribute to the Times, but I don't work in the newsroom, so I have zero.
Well, no one does anymore.
I know absolutely nothing about the internal discussion there, other than what everybody was able to see on Twitter. But the whole discourse around, wokeness and PC culture and cancel culture, whatever, I think certainly does have a generational component to it that often sort of imagines aggressors of wokeness are imaged as young, right? Or at least under 40. And I think are imagined as people who are coming from a place of oversensitivity. And that's something I hear a lot about millennials, that we're thin-skinned, that we need safe spaces. And that's what these conversations are about. And I think what folks miss is that millennials overall are just sort of a generation of people that try to be decent and try to be nice. And we are, I think, a pretty optimistic generation. I don't think we want to run around shutting down everyone who we disagree with. But I also think we're people that try not to be jerks and that did grow up in a much more diverse America than the one that our parents grew up in. And that one thing, that millennials say over and over again when you read public opinion surveys of young folks is that we do want to do our part to make the world a better place, as cheesy as that sounds. But I think for a lot of us, it's a genuine goal and something that we structure a lot of our lives around, from our personal lives to our work lives. And so you do see that, come out in these big discussions. And sometimes there are certainly excesses, but it's not because we're just, controlling leftist moral scolds. I think it is because we're trying to create a world that is kinder and gentler and more open. And to me, that's sort of as a net good.
You write, millennials have broken away from what several young people I talked to characterized as the script. Graduate from high school, go to college, get a job, get married, have kids, retire. We are marrying and having children later, often reversing the order of those things, or foregoing one, the other, or both. Some of us like the flexibility of renting, etc. And you talk elsewhere about the increasing millennial embrace of non-traditional life path. So clearly all that stuff is not chosen, as you've said. It's the result of political choices made long before. But as so often happens in history, when these kind of conditions obtain or shift in conditions, people find meaning in the new way of living. People invent new ways of living with that reality. Are you seeing interesting life innovations of the life path that people are actually embracing? What are some of the interesting new ways of living that people may not fully realize are important trends that you're seeing among young people in these conditions?
Yeah, there's so many. So we hear a lot about the millennial baby bust, right? That millennial women are having fewer children and we're having them later in life. And that's true, but so it ever was for the past 100 years, right? 200 years. With the single exception of the baby boom. So baby boomers' parents had children younger and they had more of them than their parents. But previous to that, it had been on a pretty steady trajectory. And then boomers themselves got married.
Growing awareness of what it's like to have children has just reduced the number of children people have.
Right, and being able to control the number of children you have, right? And then all these things work together in tandem. When women can go to college, or any sort of higher education, or get a job that feels meaningful, even if the meaning is just I can put money in my own pocket. Those are incentives to have children later, or to to have a sense of purpose that is not just tied to the status of childbearing, which is not to say that that's not a purposeful, meaningful thing that women find in their lives. Of course they do, but I think among millennial women in particular, we're seeing that you can derive meaning from many, many different sources, which I think is probably a net good. And so you're seeing women who are more easily able to choose when to have children and to decide that is a path they want to go down. So, that to me is a very obvious and positive one. We're seeing that millennial marriages are a lot more stable when we do get married, which is interesting. And as I suppose you would expect, that if you get married at 30, you probably have a better sense of who you are and what you want and how to manage conflict than if you get married at 17. So millennials are marrying later or marrying less often, but we're also getting divorced less often when we do get married. So that's a positive trajectory. And then
I don't know if you remember, there was that amazing David Foster Wallace evisceration of John Updike. And it was this thing about like, we are the children of all your divorces and all your infidelities. And so we are rebelling against your rebellion. It was a very powerful piece.
Definitely. And I think, we're doing marriage differently. And a lot of millennials have marital relationships that do not look like the traditional ones that our parents and our grandparents had. And a huge number of millennials aren't getting married, but are raising children, either on their own or with a partner who they're just not married to. I think we're also seeing, honestly, what your wife, Priya, has written about in her book, these different ways, which is a great book, and you guys should buy it as in addition to Anand's, but these different ways of gathering and connecting. And that when these sort of old ties of kin and family and bloodlines are no longer how we organize our lives, well then, how do we organize them in a way that feels meaningful? And, sometimes that's based on where you live, sometimes it's based on, a set of interests. Not for this book, but for my last one, I went and stayed in an intentional community in Seattle, in a group of unrelated adults who were all raising their children together and living in a shared house according to a shared set of values. And not all of them were millennials. But I do think we're starting to think more radically about how do we want to live, and just because we've done things a certain way doesn't mean we have to do it that way in the future. I understand why that can be scary to people who like the old way, but I do think it's a net good.
You talk about how we should, potentially adopt Swedish-like social policies to support family formation, family survival. Do you think we need policies that make it easier for people to be married, or policies that make it easier for people to not be married and still do all the stuff in life?
Both. Definitely both. And I think we frankly need policies that recognize that human relationships are complex, and that a romantic relationship is not necessarily the primary one that people will have in their lives. And so perhaps privileging marriage above all else doesn't make a whole lot of sense. One study that I often go back to and think of was out of Minnesota, and it looked at essentially what happened when Minnesota changed its welfare rule to not kick women off the welfare rolls if they got married and therefore their household incomes went up. The way it typically works is if you make above a certain amount of money, you then lose some of your benefits, right? And so there are incentives to not make above that amount of money, including not getting married. And what they found is when they got rid of that rule and women could get married, A, more of them did, but then B, more of them were actually able to leave domestic violence situations. It seemed like there was kind of this light for the possibility of another relationship that wasn't going to financially compromise you. Their kids did better. It had this whole slew of benefits, right? Like not capping what somebody is able to receive from the government because they decide to enter a certain partnership. And then of course the program got scrapped, because as it goes with programs that work. So yeah, I do think we need Swedish style benefits that, accord necessary help to folks kind of no matter what their choices are, right? If you look at marital rates in Sweden among young people, they're actually not super high. There are a lot of women who, are technically single women, but in reality are rearing children with long-term partners. And do you have that marriage certificate or not is not really the deciding factor of whether you can have a healthy, stable life. And in the US, you really see a huge difference between the outcomes of children who are raised by married parents and children who are raised by single parents. And that has very, very little to do with marital status. It is almost everything to do with time and resources, which we sort of systematically take away from single parents in particular.
Among the many waves of feminism that are invented and reinvented in every generation, what is new and interesting in millennial feminism?
Oh, so much. Of course, it's not perfect. It's a social justice movement like any other that is kind of always evolving and learning and shifting. But I think one thing that millennial feminists are particularly good at doing is looking at where issues intertwine and trying not to sort of strip out, okay, can we isolate something like abortion and put it all over here by itself? Can we isolate equal pay and put it over here by itself? I think we're much better at realizing that, you know, those sort of buckets of issues, first of all, affect different women differently, and B, all intertwine with each other. You might call it intersectionality, a term that was invented by a baby boomer.
Yes.
But, you know, when you think about, to use the two examples that I just tossed off the top of my head, if you don't have the right to decide the number and spacing of your children or whether to have children, it is very hard then to work the way you would like and be paid fairly, right? Abortion is an economic issue as much as it's a human rights issue. You know, when you talk about things like abortion access, I think a lot of millennial feminists will also say, you know, we absolutely need to talk about that, but we also need to talk about, you know, what boomer Loretta Ross coined as reproductive justice, which is you also have the right to have children when you want to have them. Can you parent your children? Can you raise your children in safe and healthy neighborhoods that are not, you know, polluted by environmental toxins, that are not over-policed? You know, that all of these things intertwine with each other. And so it's, to me, that's an exciting sort of shift in millennial feminism, that we are understanding that these issues are big and complex and aren't afraid to grapple with them as such.
Last question too from me before we get questions from you, the crowd. How do you think in terms of the coming of age journey of millennials, how do you think the kind of hall of mirror of likes and social media and that whole thing, and the harassment that is so rife in the online world, how has it shaped being young and then being, you know, ex-young, in a way that feels enduring to you?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to make me sound like a boomer, but I think it's like a total disaster. I think it's horrible for our mental health. I'm glad that I did not grow up in a time where I had social media as a kid. And, you know, I do worry about what happens to folks that are, you know, that are younger than millennials, who have all of their, you know, youthful, idiotic ideas and actions preserved forever online. One of the stats that was most shocking to me in researching the book was that 1 in 5 millennials says they have no friends and no acquaintances beyond their immediate family. And I don't think that you can separate that out from the technological universe that millennials came of age in, that we're now in this place where you can, you know, if you want to, you can do kind of everything from home. I think we think of older folks as isolated and sort of the lonely generation, but it really is younger ones. And I think when you're also looking at a generation that has serious mental health issues, that often lacks health insurance, that is often in debt, often holds medical debt, would like to seek help and can't, and then you sort of hand them all the technological innovations that make, you know, bullying very easy, that make harassment very easy, and that make isolation very easy. You know, as much as I think technology is amazing and is working for us quite well right now, there have also been a lot of really disastrous impacts. And I think millennials are kind of the canaries in the coal mine for some of the bigger problems that are waiting for us down the bend.
If you are a boomer, and I see some of these folks in the chat maybe slightly aggrieved, I'm sure it's not the first time in your book tour. If you are a boomer, you're not the president, you're not a person who runs a big company, but you're a regular person, boomer, and maybe you feel slightly accused by all of this, which is not exactly what you're saying, but you feel that way. And yet in some small area of your life, you do have a job that, you know, could go to someone from a different generation, or you do have a voice that, what are you supposed to do? It's very hard for people in any kind of walk of life, whether they can afford it, not afford it, so on and so forth, to actually cede power. What can regular people do if they agree with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think it's kind of definitely worth saying here that, you know, as I said earlier, boomers are an incredibly politically polarized generation. And the boomers that are tuning in to an event with you and I at the Strand bookstore, broadcast from New York City, are probably not the boomers who are electing somebody like Donald Trump to office. Although
it's a bookstore. So
sorry,
it's a bookstore.
Exactly. I often when we talk about boomers, including when I talk about boomers, there is a tendency to paint with too broad of a brush and sort of indict the whole generation for the choices of the conservative half of it. But that said, on an individual level, I would love to see boomers thinking about, okay, how can I pull up a seat at whatever table it is that I'm sitting at for younger people, and not in like this is our like youth council who we're going to trot out as young and pat them on the head the way that frankly Democrats kind of did at the DNC. But how can we actually share power, share resources, really hear what younger folks are saying, and not just write it off as youthful folly or inexperience, but be thoughtful about including who you vote for, right? Like, look at how younger folks are voting. They have a much bigger stake in the future than older ones do. And it's very easy, I think, for people to write off, for example, politicians like AOC, who seems to be like the most polarizing people in America. But I think it would be worth it for boomers to listen to what she's saying and ask themselves, well, why is it that young folks are demanding universal health care? Why is it that I love my Medicare so much, and yet I can't understand why maybe younger people would like to get in on that too? So I think having that, first of all, understanding, and that's what I was trying to do with the book, right, is explain how we got here, why it is that millennials are so angry. I think understanding that is the first step. And then, being thoughtful about, okay, at work, are millennials on the teams that are making the big decisions for the company? When millennials, I have an example in the book of a woman who was working at an ad agency, I think I forget, it was Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. And they were working for a client.
It's going to cause a huge problem. You confusing those two, it's going to cause a huge.
I'm sure. But it was one of those cities, and she was working with a client in Atlanta. And the sort of boomer norm was you fly to the client in Atlanta. And she was saying, well, why wouldn't we just do a video conference? And it was like, no, you fly. And because the client was run by younger folks, there was often bad traffic in Atlanta. And so she would fly to Atlanta. She would then sit in a conference room. And because traffic was bad, everyone in Atlanta was at home on a video conference. And she'd be video conferencing from Atlanta to the clients in Atlanta, having just flown in from Philadelphia. And it made absolutely no sense. But no matter how many times she tried to raise the issue, the answer was, well, you're just not senior enough to have an opinion on this. And so boomers tend to be a little more hierarchical at work, a little more analog at work. And I know get frustrated when it feels like millennials are jumping the line and are pushing for changes. But I guess I would say that that is kind of one relatively small but I think impactful thing that boomers could do is really listen to younger folks and see if to whatever extent you can incorporate not just their feedback but also help move them up the chain. I think that is something that sort of average everyday people can do, and start voting like millennials would be helpful too.
You're calling basically for the rise of the boomer ally, which I think is a good idea. So first question from the audience, from Adam, I believe it is. What was something that surprised you during your research process for the book, either negative or positive?
There was a lot that was surprising. I mean, I would say I thought that I more or less understood the story of how millennials were behind. And actually in doing the research, I found it pretty shocking, the degree to which millennials are not doing nearly as well as our boomer parents. So, one of those stats that stands out is that millennials were 22% of American adults, and yet we hold only 3% of American wealth. Whereas when boomers were young adults, when they were a little older than us, but close to where we are now, they held 21% of American wealth. So you're just not going to see that bridge. You're not going to see that gap bridge. We're not going to go from holding 3% to 21% in the next 2 or 3 years, which does suggest that we're going to be, left behind forever.
Next question from Matt. I'd love to hear your future predictions about the Overton window. In other words, what sort of things can we feel optimistic about and look forward to that millennials will bring about in the world that will feel like a no-brainer by 2040?
Oh, I think we can feel optimistic about so many things. I know often when I talk about this book, I list all of these stats that are such downers. But millennials, as I think an optimistic, progressive, forward-thinking generation, are moving the needle quite a bit on issues of race and gender. I think issues like trans rights, we're gonna see as relics, I hope, in 10 or 20 years, right? That the idea that transgender people exist and should have the same rights as everybody else, to live who they are and with dignity will, I hope, be something that we look back on and feel ashamed about what we're doing now. And I hope when we look back on the Black Lives Matter movement, we're going to see it certainly through the same lens that we see the civil rights movement now, which is that everybody kind of lays claim to it and we all agree it was a good idea, even though right now clearly the American right does not think that. And I do think when you look at who's been protesting on the streets this summer, it is overwhelmingly people under the age of 40, so millennials and Gen Zers. I think if those are the kids carrying the future, then I feel good, at least, about where we're going on questions of gender and race.
A question from Veronica. A question I get a lot whenever I wade into these age issues. How do millennials feel about Gen X? How do we fit into their world? There's a very strong Gen X feeling of being erased from discussions about age. How do you react to that?
Yeah, every time I tweet about this, it's like 87 angry Gen Xers in my mentions being like, what about us? I would say, obviously, demographically, Gen Xers are a much smaller generation, which is why I think they often get left out of these conversations. But they're certainly an important generation to address. I think Gen Xers aren't met with the same level of hostility as boomers are because they're sort of just not considered, and I don't think they are, as responsible for so many of the political decisions that have left us here. I think there's still something like a little bit cool about being Gen X, which I hope they appreciate me saying and stop yelling at me on the internet. And in some ways, Gen Xers were at the front end of so much of what millennials are experiencing, right? It's not like everything changed on January 1st, 1980. There was a decline that led up to a much steeper decline that millennials have experienced. And so Gen Xers also didn't do as well as baby boomers and certainly did get hit, for example, by the 2008, 2009 recession, high college costs. Gen Xers have definitely suffered too. You just sort of see less of a tremendous social impact because there's fewer of them.
This is a very interesting question from Anna. Given that millennials switch jobs and careers at a higher rate than boomers, again, not their fault necessarily, but how can they amass power within companies to affect the company's policies? Why should companies give power to employees who they know are not likely to be there long term?
So this is actually a myth that millennials job hop more than baby boomers.
Wow.
We don't. Young people job hop. And baby boomers job hopped too when they were young. So, and I'm now totally blanking on the name of the man who did this research, but Gray Kimbrough, who's also an economist, I know has cited this, and I'm not sure if he's the one that actually did the study or not, but he has certainly asserted, and research has found, that millennials don't job hop any more than baby boomers do. That said, millennials are less employed than baby boomers were at our age, and we are more likely to be cobbling together gig jobs, multiple jobs just to make ends meet. We're more likely to be doing freelance contract work, the kind of gig jobs that have really taken a huge hit because of COVID-19. So it is true that there are serious challenges to millennials, rising in the ranks of their jobs. If you're an Uber driver, how are you supposed to rise up the ranks of a company that claims it doesn't even employ you, right? So some of these questions, obviously, most of these questions, frankly, cannot be solved by personal choices. They can't be solved by individual baby boomers giving individual millennials a hand up, although I hope individual baby boomers will still do that. They're really only going to be solved by much bigger picture structural changes in employment, in wealth, in how we distribute resources.
Great comment. not a question from Kamina. I am a Gen Xer and I am glad I am not in your book. Thank you.
Yeah, that's like the Gen X line. It's like,
So
we
Gen X.
don't even care if you notice us or not.
If you don't want me in your book, I'm happy I'm not in your book. Question from Laura. Can you let us know a few other myths about millennials?
Yeah, so I mean, one myth I hear is that we aren't very hardworking, that, you know, we, I don't know, just like want to work freelance jobs so we can coast in life, which is definitely not true. Americans today work almost a month more per year than Americans worked in 1980. Now that's, you know, the average among all Americans, not just millennials, but given that millennials are 22% of adults, that's a lot of us. Millennials have fewer vacation days and are also less likely to take those vacation days. We certainly feel like we can't take vacation. We are more likely to work and to stay connected on vacation than baby boomers are, you know, which is definitely true for me. Like, I wrote entire chunks of this book while I was on vacation. So that, I think, is a pretty pervasive one, that, yeah, that we job hop, that we want to move up the chain at work too soon. This is one that I hear a lot that I think boomers get frustrated by, is like, well, you just showed up here yesterday. You know, why do you think that you should get a promotion? And I think it is true that millennials do try to assert ourselves at work perhaps more than boomers did, and are sort of a less hierarchical generation. We don't really understand why, you know, if I'm doing better work and I'm more efficient and I'm having a better outcome, why should I have to wait just because, like, Bob was here for 5 years before he got promoted? And I think, you know, what boomers miss is why that ethos exists. And part of it is the sort of parent-friend lack of hierarchy thing that I was talking about earlier. But I think a bigger part of it is that our lives are just really, really tenuous. Our work lives are tenuous. We were, you know, the most likely to lose our jobs, both in the Great Recession of 2008 and now during COVID. Millennials have lost more jobs than anybody else. But coming of age in the recession, I think we realized right away, well, workplaces aren't really going to do much for us. And, you know, we don't have that guarantee that somebody is going to mentor us and help us up the ladder. And so we really have to assert whatever we can to make our own lives and our own careers. And I think a lot of boomers see that as line jumping, and a lot of millennials see it as survival.
And it's interesting. I mean, to the point that you made a few times in different ways tonight, you know, it's also eternal. Like, I remember in Mad Men, like there was a difference in hierarchical attitudes in the kind of men in the early 60s part of the show, and the younger, scruffier, bigger haired guys in the later 60s part of the show. I mean, it's also just, this is just sort of changing society. Good question from Tristan. How do you see neoliberal capitalism fitting into all of this, specifically in millennials' cultural attitudes as compared to boomers? And maybe you can answer that question by way of the big socialism question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a cornerstone to this whole book. I mean, the book is a class critique as much as anything else. Neoliberal capitalism has failed millennials, and I think that's clear in how we vote, and the fact that, you know, we are a generation that doesn't see socialism as scary. You know, most of us grew up sort of at the tail end of the Cold War, after the Cold War had ended. You know, we didn't grow up with that sort of looming sense of fear of, like, we're going to get nuked, and so let's hide under our desks, right? Because that's going to shield you from a nuclear apocalypse. I think instead what we've seen, and I do think technology really feeds into this, is that we can look, you know, even if we don't physically travel there, we can look overseas to our economic peer countries, and we can see how they're doing, and we can see how young people are faring, and we can see that, you know, a young person in Finland is not going to have 5 or 6 figure student loan debt unless they went to school in the US. We can see that a mother in Sweden, you know, gets 9 months of paid leave to take care of a new child, and that a father in Sweden gets the same thing. And, you know, we can see that, okay, fine, the word you put on that is socialism, which was such, you know, a boogeyman for our parents' whole lives. But for us, it's sort of defanged. It doesn't, you know, to us, it describes a system that, frankly, in a lot of ways looks a lot better. So yeah, you know, I think the conditions of American capitalism and where it has left millennials absolutely shapes our sort of generational shift toward the left generally, and for many of us toward socialism specifically. And I think a lot of boomers look at that and they find that scary, and I understand that. But I guess what I would say is, well, figure out why. Things aren't working. And so, we're really trawling around looking for what will. And we see some pretty good evidence, over in Western Europe of what does seem to work. And unless, you're offering us a better solution, I think a lot of us think that certainly we have models that have worked before and we should start trying them now.
I want to read you this. It's one of these, I have a comment more than a question, but I think it's a sentiment that is not rare in this discussion. I want you to respond to it. I don't know how you say his name. Is Irenka? So the comment is this: it sounds to me as if you haven't had deep, heartfelt conversations with enough boomers to understand the struggles and challenges we faced as young adults. We grew up protesting the Vietnam War, racial injustice, sexual assault, inequality, and more. Many of us are not traditionalists. We grew up with high ideals with a desire to change the world, peace and love. I don't know the boomers you described sounds more 50s driven. We did the women's movement much more. What are your thoughts?
So I hear that a lot. And yes, absolutely. It is not the case that all boomers are right-wing reactionaries. It is the reality that, first of all, boomers were not the founders of the civil rights movement or the feminist movement or even the anti-war movement, although they certainly were foot soldiers in a lot of those movements. That was a pretty small number of people. I mean, this is, again, something that I think the whole country now lays claim to, right? Civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the anti-war movement. But numerically, it was a small number. And those movements were all really unpopular in their time. Nor were they necessarily embraced by, a huge majority of young people, right? And what we did see is that once boomers came of age and once, almost the whole generation was 18 by 1984, the whole generation was 18 by 1984, the first president that boomers voted in was Ronald Reagan. There was a huge right-wing backlash. So, the point that I'm trying to make is not that, all boomers did this or did that, but that many of the stories that boomers, including the boomers of the right of Fox News, tell about their generation are not necessarily true and weren't true at the time, which does not mean, again, that there were no boomers doing good, important work for feminism and civil rights. There were, but they are and were a minority of their generation. And part of my hope with this book is that the boomers who were doing the protesting, who do lay claim to those movements today, are the ones that are going to be receptive to this, right? They're not the folks who are voting for Donald Trump. And so the goal is to talk about, all right, how can those folks who have been doing work on issues that millennials also care about, help us to pick up the torch? How can we collaborate? How can we work in tandem to create a future that millennials and younger folks need?
Last question. There's a lot of passion in the chat thread. There's lots of hurt feelings. There's all kinds of exciting things going on there. But I think this is all very important. This is what books are for. And I congratulate you for starting that dialogue or sustaining that dialogue with this book. Last question. With the pained chat in mind, what will it take to have the kind of intergenerational dialogue that might actually push things forward on this issue?
Yeah, so I think it's going to take a little turning down of the temperature and a little humility on both sides. I think certainly, and that's what I tried to do with the book. So, it would be great if folks would read it. I think it's helpful in fostering understanding in both directions. I think certainly on the millennial side, it would really serve us well to recognize that not every baby boomer is part of like the Reagan youth, right? And there are a lot of boomers who've been working on the issues that we care about most for their entire adult lives. And then often the folks we think about as, the founders and luminaries of the movements way back when are not boomers. And when you look at the boomers who are associated with those movements, there are people who many of us consider the most relevant, right? So people like Brian Stevenson is a baby boomer. And I mentioned Loretta Ross, she's a baby boomer. Kimberly Crenshaw is a baby boomer. Feminist writer Rebecca Solnit is a baby boomer. RuPaul is a baby boomer. baby boomers, I think millennials often use that term as sort of a catch-all for old. And really, there are a ton of boomers who have been doing this great work for a long time, from whom millennials have a tremendous amount to learn. And who we're frankly already working with. And so I think us coming into the discussion with a little less, being a little overly simplistic about who boomers are would certainly be useful in fostering discussion. And then from boomers, I would love to see a little more open-mindedness about the fact that, look, when you were young, people accused you of doing it wrong too, right? And the millennials who are picking up the torches on issues like feminism, on issues like racial justice, on issues like LGBT rights, we're sometimes going to use different words. We're sometimes going to frame these issues differently. We're going to come to them differently. And that's because you guys moved the needle, right? You moved it forward. Huge accomplishments happened because of baby boomer activists. So we're not fighting the same fights that we were fighting in the 60s, and not in the same way. And so allowing millennials, the space to take up positions of power and to have more influence over where these movements are headed, what they focus on, how American politics look going forward is really crucial. So a little bit more understanding, humility, generosity on both sides. I think
peace, love, and understanding, to quote a boomer anthem.
Right.
And I just want to say, with this discussion, which I actually view as positive, whether or not those of you in the chat actually do view it as positive, like if you want to get comfortable, I recommend reading your Facebook feed with all the pre-selected people that you have chosen to follow, or the bubble bath of your Twitter feed with all the affirmation that you've curated for yourself. Books are about making yourself constructively uncomfortable, and this is a fantastic book for that purpose. So I encourage you to pick it up. Have this dialogue within your families, have it with other people of your generation, whatever generation that is. And thank you also to the Strand Bookstore, which in this moment that's tough for culture, tough for writers, tough for books, has been fighting for what Jill and I both do for a very long time and continues to do so and does an amazing job of it. So get Jill's book, support the Strand, and thank you for coming out tonight.
Thanks so much, Anand, and thanks to the Strand and everybody who listened.